Hello, everyone, on this beautiful, windy afternoon. So we are going to jump in on our conversation on climate with Emily and Megan. And I think I just want to open with both of you, just starting on just how you approach climate in your work and how it shows up.
Thanks for the question, Nadege. So I was writing about climate change before I understood I was writing about climate change. My last book is called Searching for Zion, and it's about the meaning of the book of Exodus and the story of the promised land for the descendants of the enslaved. And my subjects in that book included African Hebrew Israelites in Israel, originally from Detroit, Rastafarians originally from Jamaica, living in Ethiopia, and African American expats living in Ghana, and finally members of my own family. My dad's side of the family are Black Creoles from Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, who were displaced by Hurricane Katrina and scattered from their home place of many generations to places like Atlanta and Houston. So I thought at the time that I was writing about the complicated meaning of home for Black people, about the kinds of disenfranchisement and disinheritance that cause some folks to leave home to find a more liberated home elsewhere. But when I talked to people like my cousin Tracy, who survived Katrina, I understood I was really writing about resilience. And that's a term, resilience, that gets used a lot when we talk about climate mitigation. Mm-hmm. But it's my view that we don't often enough center resilient voices and examples of survival from Black and other communities of color at the front lines of the climate crisis when we talk about climate change. So I appreciate, the young people in the Sunrise Movement for pointing out that the fights for racial justice and climate action are two fronts of the same fight. The Sunrise Movement, they say if our society valued Black, brown, and indigenous lives, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in with climate change in the first place. If Black lives mattered, we would have had a new Green Deal almost 2 decades ago when Katrina killed 1,833 people and left tens of thousands more without homes in predominantly Black neighborhoods. So I bring up Katrina because it was a really watershed moment for us. We remember it as one of the worst cases of 21st century environmental injustice in the U.S., since it devastated majority Black communities in and around New Orleans as a result of vulnerabilities from unequal housing quality, income levels, mitigating resources, and highly inefficient government response. But so for the past few years, I've been writing more explicitly about climate change and environmental justice, often through the lens of motherhood. Because, honestly speaking, because I'm fearful for and protective of the lives of my own Black children's lives, and angered by environmental inequities in my own community in the Bronx, where my husband and I are raising them. And I'm happy to give a little bit more context as we continue to talk from the Environmental Defense Fund about Black communities and climate change in the U.S., but I'd really love to hear from Megan about climate change in her own writing and thinking about climate change.
Thanks, Emily. And I'm processing all of the things that you just said because I'm really excited to see where our conversation goes, even though that seems a little dark to say while talking about climate change and environmental justice. So in my work, especially in my first novel, Lakewood, in the latter half of the book, there's a veering off where there are issues surrounding the city's water. And in some ways, that is directly influenced by the Flint water crisis, where my older sister lives in Flint. My niece was impacted by the Flint water crisis. And I was thinking a lot about the different ways where we have acceptable victims for these issues. and the people whose lives are still impacted because Flint still does not have clean water in many of the less wealthy areas. And increasingly in Jackson, Mississippi, again, we're having another water crisis in a predominantly black community. And again, it seems to sort of just bubble up to the surface of the news and then disappear because for better, well, there's no for better here, but for worse, we have an idea of what the right kind of climate victim is. We have the idea of who should be centered in these conversations. And I think especially when you're writing about place, and I think it's worth thinking really deeply about the ways that place shapes the person or people at the center of your work, and how the more that we're going to write works that might have realistic ideas about place, you can't really do that without thinking about climate change, without climate justice, and who gets to live like the very nice, quiet life in a brownstone in some fiction, and who's thinking, what happens if the power goes off? Can I afford this? What can happen?
Can you say more on writing Black people into the conversation around climate? Because I love what you just said about just even Rastas, right? In the Caribbean, Rastas are the keepers, right? They are the naturalists. They are vegans before, vegan stuff was overpriced in our local Targets, and they are gardeners, and they are the ones who, are like, please don't put any extra additives into this. We don't need extra. But seeing Black folks in the stories with a sense of place, with a sense of dignity, even, both not just as victims, but as caretakers, right? And as the ones who are on the front lines of fighting.
Yeah, not just as victims, not just as caretakers, but also because it's dramatically compelling. Like to think about how wasteful. I'm thinking about for fiction, right? Like how wasteful not to use climate change as a dramatic backdrop or event. Just a storm, the way that a storm magnifies emotion and tension. I mean, I'll speak a little bit, not just as a writer, but as a teacher of writing. I'm a professor in the English department at the City College of New York, which is in the CUNY system, and our campus is in Harlem. And I've been really motivated by a book by Amitav Ghosh called The Great Derangement, which came out a few years ago and makes as its case that for writers who are not using the filter of the climate crisis through which their characters are moving through, inhabiting the world and having problems encounter and overcome, you risk having future readers, should you be so lucky to have them, thinking of you as deranged, right? Mm-hmm. Like that if there's climate silence on the page, a future reader will think you're deranged not to have seen it. Mm-hmm. So I've been teaching climate writing, explicitly climate writing, for the past few years, past 3 years maybe at City College, so that my students can understand, so that they can have a place to exercise some of their own fears, like to be honest about it, and experiences, but B, because there's a lot of dramatic potential. So I know Megan also had some things to say about longstanding examples in fiction. Some of the authors that I teach in that class, including Octavia Butler, who I know Tanana Reeve-Dew was speaking about before us, right? Like, who foresaw a lot of the kind of climate disaster in her fiction coming out 30 years ago that we're experiencing now in ways that seem like futuristic, but in fact were merely prescient, because she knew how to read the news and put things together. But Megan, what do you have to say about Black people in fiction and climate crisis and emergency?
You know, one of the places I keep going back to lately is Their Eyes Were Watching God. Mm-hmm. And the first time I was taught Their Eyes Were Watching God, it wasn't by a Black instructor. And one of the questions he posed to the class is, why is there this storm at the end? Why are there all these tales of displacement? And at first, I'm really trying not to dunk on this professor, but it's going to sound like I am. But it was one of those situations where at first I thought, oh, okay, this might be like this brilliant line of questioning. We're going to think really deeply about the ways that Black people have been impacted historically by having to eke out our lives on the margins, like you see it in like Morrison's work a lot. You think about all the ways that our people have been displaced to the less fertile land, and that in its own way is getting you ready for climate displacement. It's in our blood. And it became really clear that he genuinely didn't understand why Hurston would go here, where it was like that act of, you kind of admire, I'm a professor at Minnesota, and I always admire when someone can go into a classroom and say, I don't know this, can you explain it to me? But it also still kind of sticks with me as this kind of failing of, why are you teaching this work without thinking deeply about the ways that Black people live, or doing the research and thinking deeply about it? And I kind of think it's also this brilliant journey, the more I read and think about climate change, where you have Janie in this pear tree. It's one of my favorite passages in all of literature, where the pear tree is just blooming and wonderful, and you can see everything that the earth can give us. It's been caretaken by Janie's family. It's also Janie, because she's blooming and full of beauty. And then you move to the much harder times in her life, where she's displaced by the storm and the flood. And unfortunately, building a resilience. We were talking backstage about this desire and push and pull between the idea of you have to be resilient to keep living, and also the desire for softness. Like you said that so brilliantly. And I'm going to have you weigh in a second on this, I already know. But it's right there in Morrison's work.
Yeah.
When did the novel come out? 1920? I can never remember.
1920s.
But it's there. It's how we're already trying to live in this world, the mixture between softness and resilience, and finding our way and pulling things close.
Yeah, we were talking about the way language is used when we talk about climate, and of course, resilience is like one of the big buzzwords around climate and climate change. But we were juxtaposing like what climate resilience is supposed to be, and how as Black folks, we are often called resilient in a way that can also be very harmful. Because if the expectation is that you're always resilient, there's no space to not be. You can't be soft. You can't break down. You must always be able to withstand, right? And sometimes we just need to lay down. But around climate change and resilience, right, when we talk about what resilience means, it's being able to withstand, right? Will we still be here after the storm? Will the structure still be standing after the storm? And we can't talk about climate change and not address economic injustice, because so much of what is climate resilience means money, right? Are you able to build after the storm? Do you have insurance?
Yeah. I was just thinking that the professor you're trying not to dunk on, you might not have been so aware of the context behind that book, the historical context. Like, it's just missing so much. Janie is a character who we get to see be soft and resilient at once, and I think like that's one of the beautiful things about fiction. She gets to be fully human, right? While living at the bottom in an endangered space, she gets to experience love, like a journey towards love, and there's loss, but that image of the pear tree it's so important. I agree with you, Megan. It's just one of the most beautiful images in all of literature. But I don't know. I mean, some of the context I feel like your professor might have been missing when he introduced that book to you. I'd like to give some of it now to ground the conversation, because Black communities in the U.S., Black and brown communities in the U.S., of course, suffer the effects of climate change first and worst, and I mean, we all know here that the climate crisis is real and here, and we're feeling its effects. We know it's causing more frequent and severe weather events, including heavy rainfall and dangerous storms and droughts and heat waves, and that it's increasing the spread of infectious diseases and interfering with our food sources and straining our infrastructure like bridges and sewer systems. But even though it impacts all Americans, it especially hits our communities disproportionately, and those of us living in Black communities are more vulnerable to severe weather and floods. And this is because a lot of us are also adjacent to power plants and petrochemical factories and other polluting sites that are really ill-equipped to deal with flooding. So after Hurricane Harvey, for example, petrochemical plants released cancer-causing benzene at rate 6 times safe levels, and neighborhoods near Superfund sites are more likely to be Black. Mm-hmm. And historically, segregation has resulted in our communities living in less desirable, low-lying and flood-prone areas in cities throughout the U.S., not just New Orleans, which lost a third of its Black residents to climate migration who never returned. But it also worsens air pollution, exacerbating inequities in Black communities and threatening people like my 2 children who have asthma, making it harder to breathe. And Black Americans with asthma are 3 times as likely than whites to be hospitalized or die from an asthma attack. So, these factors, even the heat island effect, the fact that you're talking about Miami and heat, we talk about flooding, but maybe not enough about heat and how it affects Black communities worse due to maybe less likelihood of air conditioning or less tree cover. But these are all cases of what we call environmental racism, and that was a term coined by Robert Bullard, and a term that climate activists are increasingly using to address disproportionate impacts of natural disasters, flooding, and food insecurity on Black and brown communities. So, I feel as a creative writer, like we need to listen to the testimony of people who are survivors of history, and I really love this one essay by Mary Anais Heglar, as a climate essayist, writer, podcaster, and an activist. She has a wonderful essay called "Climate Change Ain't the First Existential Threat." And, what she means by that is like for any movement to claim this is like the first threat to humanity, it's like an insult to people whose ancestors have survived and endured and survived enslavement, or colonization or genocide. There's this First Nations writer, Wokashik Rice, I really love, who says, the world has already ended. Like, we know that world has already ended, but we're still here. So anyway, my next book, it's called Lessons for Survival, and I'm really interested in interviewing, in the process of interviewing people in frontline communities for testimonies, not as victims, like we were saying before, not as victims, but and not merely as survivors, right? Or just
Existers.
Existers, or
yeah.
Sure, examples of resilience and lessons for us, but also as experts. Mm-hmm. How much can we here learn from Puerto Rico, from Puerto Ricans, who understand actually about okay, what does it mean to share resources and community after a devastating storm when there's not enough money to fix things and you have to be resourceful?
I would love to dig deeper into the layers of the structural issues around climate. We mentioned Miami, which is where I'm from, and in 1926 you had the Great Hurricane here in Florida that hit Miami very hard, and it really messed up Miami Beach, but not the inland Black communities. They were affected, but not horribly. But as a result of needing labor to clean up Miami Beach, the City of Miami Commission passed something called a conscription that pretty much said that if you were a black able-bodied man on the black side of Miami, you had to come clean up Miami Beach. And they came in their vans and picked people up. And I think about even modern day when there's a storm coming or another sort of, environmental disaster heading our way, who gets to take time off to prepare? Who gets to take time off to leave and come back when it all settles down? The front line tends to be people of color, the hotel workers who still have to show up to work even though the hurricane is coming. It is the landscapers, it is the folks who work in waste management, typically black men, who labor, right, to provide that safety. And so I would love for you to touch on like how you are exploring the intersections of the structural issues and how they are further exacerbated by climate change.
I've written 2 novels now, and both of them they've been termed as social justice novels because I don't steer away from issues. And also, there's the issue of when your novels are listed as social justice novels, you start getting a lot of reviews that start talking about how didactic you are, or how you're not telling a story, you're just lecturing. There's a hilarious review of my latest book on the Daily Mail. Oh, they hate me. It's really funny. But I've been thinking a lot about that because I have been trying to find a way to writing about environmental issues and thinking about all the ways where I have lovely white peers who are writing what are termed climate change novels, and I have yet to see like a major outlet review them as being didactic, even though like their main characters are activists who are going to go sabotage a billionaire, but somehow that's not didactic next to a young woman being mad about having to conform, especially a young black woman. And so one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is all of the climate writing by black writers that is probably already out there contemporarily, but even I, as a black writer working right now, it's hard for me to find them because they get buried in the sea of books. They don't get the coverage. And so I did just want to take a turn to think really deeply about why are we so resistant to like being challenged on our beliefs or think about them? Why, especially with black writers, are we still less likely to even just see coverage of social justice novels, especially around issues that are, I still feel like people don't want to read books or at least give coverage to the books by black writers about climate, or even indigenous writers about climate too, because I think we're missing a lot of those that I think already exist. So the other question I've been asking myself is, should I be writing this, or should I be seeking out those books and finding a way to get them the attention in more readership in the ways that I do have access to as a professor, or getting invited to events like this?
I think a criticism that's often levied against environmental spaces is that they tend to be predominantly white. One of my interventions, like entering this space within the last few years, has been to try to, as I said, give more space to amplify voices of color, people who I think we stand to learn a lot from. Having learned a lot, for example, from members of my own family, just about resilience and so one woman, I'll just give an example that I really enjoyed interviewing and learning from, who I just also found a fascinating character. Like, didacticism aside, like she's just sort of somebody who maybe to some people would seem kind of invisible, but she's a 50-year-old queer Black Dominicana New Yorker living in a van. And the reason she lives in a van is that her home was destroyed in Staten Island during Hurricane Sandy. And she was so traumatized by that event that she decided she needed to revolutionize her life. Her van is named Langston after Langston Hughes. And inside of her van, she has some Scrabble, like little Scrabble tiles glued to the wall, and the Scrabble tiles say, "Do epic shit," because she, almost after losing her life, she was in an area of Staten Island where half the victims in New York of Hurricane Sandy died on this coastal region of Staten Island. She lost all of her possessions, all of her books. That was the greatest loss to her, was her books, her photographs. She found herself going down wormholes of research on like prepper sites, which are also not really Black spaces, but like, sites where people are kind of sharing information about survivalist information. And she realized like, oh, there could be something liberating actually about living in a van. Like I can go where I want to. I can park near a park. I could wake up and be looking at water. Like she's a New Yorker living in a van, and it's challenging. But actually, when she looks at my life, she says like, you haven't thought at all about the fact that you should probably have an axe in your attic, like so you can chop your way out with your kids when the water rises. Like you don't have a generator, like you can afford that. You should think about, solar panels and all the, like she's telling me things that on the one level sound very frightening and alarmist, but really because she's lived through what many of us can expect. I consider her to be an expert and a really wise person, and who's had a dramatically interesting life, and who's sort of living at the edge, or at the edge of what I understand to be, at the edge of my own understanding, right? But somebody who I understand I need to learn from, and it's people like her I want to center as part of a conversation about how to think differently about survival.
And I think something you said, Megan, on why is it that when white writers write about climate, it's a story about climate, but when you're a Black writer, it gets pushed into this niche around social justice in particular. And, it is the story of Black writing, right, which Toni Morrison always talked about, which is white writers get to be universal, and Black writers don't. Right, that you're writing about Black people, so all of a sudden, like, that's different. I'm like, white people are different. Like, that's not my universal experience, right? But it doesn't mean that the story isn't something you can take something from. And even around anger, right, that there is space for white anger around climate activism, and rightfully so. And this country has always been good at holding space for white anger in a way that Black anger does not get held, even if we're talking about climate. And so I really appreciate you bringing that up, because it is a very true and maddening thing when we start talking about Black stories, and what you can even be mad about, right? Or just say it nicely. Don't yell. Don't shout about this. Ask us nicely, and maybe you'll get it, but don't be mean about, not having clean water. Don't be mean about not being able to go back to your home after the water dries. Like, be nice about it, right? That wanting you to be kind around environmental justice issues. And in particular, if you're Black, don't yell, right? Don't scream about it.
Yeah.
I want to know how you guys are, like, what are some of the issues around, like, environmental justice that you're thinking about in current work, or issues that you want to explore deeper and want to uplift?
For me, because I'm writing nonfiction at the moment and for the past few years, a lot of my exploration of environmental justice is extremely personal. So, you know, Megan mentioned her sister lives in Flint, her niece, who has to be studied neurologically to see how that water has affected her, right? Like, it's not abstract. It's like it's a family affair. So I mentioned my two children, my two boys have asthma. They were born and raised in northern Manhattan in a neighborhood called Washington Heights, which some of you know. You know, the asthma rates in Upper Manhattan, Harlem, Washington Heights are like twice that of the rest of the city, and the city itself is like 3 times the rest of the nation. So it has to do with the fact, you know, that as I was reading before about poisoning infrastructure being placed in our communities, like that's true of the neighborhood where my kids grew up. And so Washington Heights, the very top of the island of Manhattan, is choked by a nexus of highways. We lived in a building overlooking the Washington Bridge, which has the distinction of being the most heavily trafficked bridge in the world. So they're breathing these noxious fumes. And we were right by, you know, a huge bus station where the buses are just kind of idling. And so it's no wonder, like, the air pollution is very bad there. It's no wonder that so many of the kids are suffering from asthma. Like, I think about air quality, you know, as a mother, the ways that that's affecting their ability to breathe, the most basic thing.
Yeah.
So, right, like, we moved recently to the Bronx to get them away from that, to get them away from the bad air. But we're still, you know, it's still Black and brown community, so they're still poisoning infrastructure. And so, you know, my exploration of these things has to do with, like, where should I live to be safe? Like, where should my children live to be safe in very real terms? And we're talking a little bit backstage also about being mothers, the kinds of fears that our children have because they're smart and they're aware and they have their own anxiety about the climate crisis. So the same kind of question I'm asking: where should we live to be safe? Are questions my sons are now asking, thinking about their own futures. Like, where should we live to be safe? We know that the sea is rising, right? That we live in a coastal city. That this home we've bought in the Bronx may not be one that I can leave to my children. It may be underwater.
Yeah.
To take more of a teaching tact, one of the things I like to do in my undergrad creative writing classes is I have them do this exercise where I have them create a town. And I have them start off first with the town, and they write a paragraph, and it's 50 years ago. And then they build another 10 years for each one until they're in the future. And I have them start asking themselves, every time we take a step into the future, what do you actually want to see change in the world? Mm-hmm. What do you see as something that you can't ever imagine changing in the world? And how does that impact the town each time you take this 10-decade leap into the future? And how can you communicate that indirectly? And are there any moments where no matter how you try to approach it, you have to directly say something? And the idea is the simultaneous thing of them learning how to write about issues and also learning when to say something direct, and also thinking really deeply about the ways that they actually see the world. Because I think so often when you're starting off writing on any level, you get really scared to say exactly what you think about the world or to even talk about the world as you see it. Because, I mean, it's natural. It's easy to be like, well, I'm just one person. Who cares what I think or shape about the world? But that's one of the things you overcome as a writer. You have to be willing to say something to get people to read your work.
I mean, earlier today there was the panel, amazing panel with Annette Gordon-Reed, and talking about history and interrogating archives, right? And in the way, I think she said something like, she was talking about Baldwin, and she said, Baldwin wasn't a historian, but he talked about history, right? And so I wonder for you guys, I know I come at this, like the climate work, from a nonfiction lens as well as a reporter. And I remember reporting out a series on climate gentrification in Miami and the historical lens around that was really digging into archives on how Black people in Miami actually ended up on higher elevation than white folks. White folks coveted the beaches and kept Black folks through redlining far away from the beaches, but they were low-lying areas. But now that we know about flooding, those higher elevation areas that were built on the wrong side of the tracks, quite literally on the west side of the tracks, have become premium real estate, right? And the archives, like you can dig into the history and see literally building railroad tracks on high elevation in Miami, putting Black people west of those tracks, and putting white people in low-lying areas along the shore. And now we are seeing a migration in Miami from that side to these higher elevation areas, which is also going to cause displacement. And so I think it's a very interesting juxtaposition in how the historical record around housing segregation in Miami has really been able to translate what is happening from a historical lens. And so I'm just curious if you guys interrogate history and how you fold that history into the work that you're doing.
I personally feel keenly aware of that this is a moment where it feels humanity's sort of awakening to crisis. It feels like a moment in time where people are keenly aware of being in history, a part of history. And a piece of that is that we are getting talked to a lot about how this is the last generation to make the sort of changes being recommended by the IPCC to thwart disaster, right? Like our children are, begging us for change. And so as a writer, I feel, and perhaps as a parent also, like I'm thinking a lot about the future generation, and myself as the person in history, a part of a generation who we did or didn't act. We don't know. And so one of the things I did relatively recently as a writer, feeling this way, like knowing we're in an important historical moment, was to capture a lot of voices, I felt like a time capsule kind of exercise. Having learned from this climate scientist, Katharine Hayhoe, who says one of the biggest things we can do to combat the climate crisis is to talk about it. And that's because there's a wide gap between the number of us who believe in and are concerned about climate change and the number of us who speak about it at all. It's a really, really disturbingly wide gap. It's closing, but not fast enough. And that gap is called climate silence. So knowing that, I undertook to just interview a lot of people in my network, online and in real life, about how they're feeling the effects of the climate emergency in their body and in their local communities, capture what they were saying, and just write almost like a list poem. Mm-hmm. This person in this city says this person in this city or this country says this, and to begin to see the connections, the refrains between people globally across the world who are saying similar things, expressing similar fears about increasing forest fire, for example. Just thinking, okay, I want to capture this moment where people are aware, but perhaps not acting fast enough. So I'm very thinking about how it's a strange moment in time, or experience of time, because of the climate crisis. In history.
I really like this question because I think so often people neglect how much you do need to research to write fiction. And also how much you sometimes need to research to be at home. Like, I recently moved to Minneapolis, which is why this is both still pretty warm to me and also I'm like, oh, I messed up. I should have brought a coat.
I'm like, 'cause I'm struggling.
Yeah. Also, thank you all for listening to us and sitting still right now. If you need to get up and warm up for a minute, no one's going to fault you. It's taking all my willpower not to like jog around the stage for a second. But one of the things that I learned really quickly, not even really quickly because I've only been there a few months, is that Minneapolis has this register where a property could be listed as saying no blacks, no Jews. And that there are a lot of properties still where it's built into the land laws. And it's only recently that you can actively work to take those off so that there's no way that there could be a challenge on your land that you can't sell it to someone of a different race. And so it's one of those things that you start looking at because these things aren't hidden. You can, once you start researching things that we think are only dog whistles or not explicit, no, they're clear, they're right there. You can find them if you take the time to research. And then the other step of activism you can do, which a lot of people in our community are doing, is they're working to encourage and write letters to people to take these off of your land, to make it so that the land is free for other people to have actual ownership of it without them having to take the steps later because, I mean, they can't enforce those laws now. But it's still, it's like a small bit of harm you could do if you own this, is to actually take the steps to make it so that if ever a black or Jewish person buys this land, they don't have to encounter that harmful language. They don't have to think about that. They can actually, and we could talk about whether or not you, because we all have different approaches to what you want to see and what you don't, too, because sometimes it's worth thinking about, too. But it is thinking a lot about all the ways that engaging with the history of the place you live in can help you find the ways to get involved and to help other people and to make them a part of the community when they weren't historically part of the community.
Thank you for that. We have a short window for questions if there are any in the audience. So we'll open it up for questions now. You have to raise your hand very high, and someone with a microphone will come to you. Very short questions.
Okay. Going back to their eyes were watching God. I'm just wondering, of all of the ridiculous obstacles that protagonist had to overcome to get to her ultimate destination, to pull her horizon around her shoulders. Do you think that, because honestly, I've taught that and I haven't thought about it from a climate perspective, because one thing after another happened to her, and that was just another brick in her wall in a way. But then you think about her being among the people whose houses just literally floated away or washed away. So in the writing that you're doing with climate change, and especially for a black female protagonist, Tananarive Due was talking about kind of erasing herself, forgetting herself in her early writing. Do you think then that going forward in this kind of writing, there is something that I think Hurston did way ahead of her time, allowing then that protagonist to come out on top, in a sense? I mean, we know that she lost, but ultimately that last paragraph, she is back from her horizon. So that's my weak little question.
It's such a complicated and interesting question because I think it does come to some of the big questions that black fiction writers are asking themselves now. It feels still for a lot of us, I'm not talking about everybody, and I don't want to make a generalization, that you're always choosing between a trauma narrative and also what does it mean to radically imagine a different world? Do you imagine the world as you see it, or do you imagine the world as you want it to be? And it's the question that you have to ask yourself for almost every major work. And especially, I think for black writers, we're so often shown through what's on the New York Times bestsellers list or what actually gets agented. That trauma sells. That's what people want to see. They want to see that. And I think one of the ways that I do see Hurston Ford is that pulling together of there can be something more. Even in the face of everything, we can have more. And I think that's a really interesting thing for you to take into your classroom and start thinking about, because she was way ahead of her time. And also, that's the story that all of us are going to have to tell in our climate future. How do we come back to one another? How are we going to build communities that actually pull all of us in?
Any other questions? None? Okay.
Oh, there's someone in a frog
Oh, I'm
hat.
sorry. I was like, jump up and down. I don't see you.
Hello, frog hat.
Hi. I was wondering, my lovely teacher had us read a book called Dry last year, which was based on the California water crisis. And it ended quite abruptly with a ending that was very positive, and I wasn't expecting it to be positive. It kind of came out of nowhere.
Yeah.
So I wondered, what are your guys' opinions on like endings to climate fiction books? Is it better to be dire and show how terrible it could end up, or is it better to be positive about it?
How did you feel when you read a positive ending to that book that you weren't expecting? How did you feel reading that as a young person?
Yeah.
I think for me, it felt unrealistic.
Yeah.
I enjoyed the hopefulness, but I think it shows more like agency with an ending that's very like sad and depressing.
Wait, why do you think the depression, though, gives more agency? Because you're not wrong, but why do you think so? And sorry to also suddenly make you be in college class.
No worries.
But
No, I love this. I think the depressing end really showed, and it didn't have a depressing end, but it was like, I think the ending that was hopeful, it didn't show, it wasn't realistic. It wasn't showing what truly could happen. The characters were on the brink of death, and then suddenly like a helicopter drops water on them and they're alive, right?
okay, that's,
And
yes.
it seems like it would be more impactful to me if it did end with the characters dying. And that sounds very bad, but I feel like that would, cause more change, cause more people to be alert and care about this issue, the California water crisis, and, the water crisis everywhere, just climate change in general.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
What's your name?
Ainsley?
Okay, I just don't want to keep calling you Frog Hat. But Ainsley, if you were my student and you were in the class with me, also I might have signed a book for you last night. Hello,
Oh,
Ainsley.
I was the
Yeah.
one that wasn't there, but my friend brought the book.
Yeah, that's Mia. Hey. I would ask you as a fiction writer, because so often, like someone around your age, I think you think that fiction's just imagination, but you have the choice, especially in your generation. You can build new endings. You can think of the ways that your fiction can talk to other people. So, yeah, maybe those people should have died in the California wastelands if you were writing the book. But you might also think about, can you tell a story that gets people to think about the ways that they can survive? Can you think of the ways that maybe death isn't the answer, because then you get wrapped in the tragedy of nothingness, and then you spiral out into how we're all going to be nothing eventually? And that's some, I know, I'm sorry. But it can also be worth thinking really deeply about, is there an in-between? Is there a way that you can open up your radical imagination to give people ideas of what they can do to help others and to help themselves? That isn't just a helicopter that is burning a ton of fossil fuels, just dumping some bottled water on someone's head. That's what I'm imagining the scene based on how you described it.
That's quite like what it was, yes.
Who would not love a magical helicopter coming to give you whatever you want at the right moment? But you could think of another path to that. What's more realistic? What can you say or how you can do it? Because that's the other way that fiction writing works, is that you read something that pisses you off, and then you're like, well, I can do better than that, and then you write a whole book.
I just wanted to add, finally, even in nonfiction, we don't know the end of this story. Even in reality, we don't know the end of this story. And when I started writing in the field of climate, I felt very despairing and very frightening the more I researched and read. Very, very, very scared and worried. And I wrote a letter to a writer that I deeply admired and had sat on a panel with, who has since passed away, and that's Barry Lopez. For those of you who don't know his work, you have a treat ahead of you. His most famous work is Arctic Dreams. And Barry Lopez was quite aged at the time that I wrote to him. I didn't know it, but he was living with the cancer that would take his life a couple of years later. And he didn't have an email address. You had to write him like an old-fashioned letter and send it to a P.O. box. And I sent him this letter saying, I don't know now that I'm doing this kind of writing, how to strike the right balance between hope and despair. Can you educate me? And like a few weeks later, I got this letter. Like, who gets letters anymore? And he had typewritten it, but then also like made some corrections in his handwriting on the sides. I've held on to this letter. It's very dear to me. But the takeaway was, and like all good teachers, like what you just did for Ainsley, he basically, he didn't give me the answer. He said, that is the question. What is the right balance between hope and despair? That's the right question.
And I think on that note, that's a beautiful note to end on. We are at time. Thank you all so much for joining us.